There are moments in a man's life when the very fabric of his existence shifts beneath his feet, when what he believed to be his destiny transforms into something entirely unforeseen. I am Captain Roderick Ashworth, 28 years of age, and as I write these words by the flickering light of my study's hearth, I can scarcely believe the extraordinary turn my life has taken. The winter wind howls against the diamond-paned windows of my modest estate, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of change, much like it did on that fateful December evening when Lord Pemberton's messenger arrived at my door. The year was 1684, and England lay beneath a blanket of the harshest winter in living memory. I had returned from the Low Countries only 3 months prior, my sword finally sheathed after years of service to King James. The campaigns had been brutal, leaving their mark not only on my body but on my very soul. A jagged scar runs from my left temple to my jaw, a reminder of Dutch steel that came too close to ending my story entirely. But it was not the physical wounds that troubled me most during those long winter nights at Ashworth Manor. It was the weight of all I had witnessed, the screams that still echoed in my dreams, the faces of fallen comrades that visited me in the small hours before dawn. My estate, inherited upon my elder brother's death from fever 2 years earlier, was neither grand nor wealthy. Ashworth Manor stood as a testament to faded nobility, its Tudor stones weathered by centuries of Yorkshire rain and wind. The halls that had once echoed with laughter now held only the footsteps of myself and my small household staff. I had accepted that my future would be one of quiet solitude, tending to my lands and perhaps writing of my experiences in service to the crown. Marriage seemed a distant possibility for a second son with more scars than coin. Then came that December night when everything changed. The messenger rode through a blizzard that would have turned lesser men back, his horse's hoofs thundering against the cobblestones of my courtyard. I remember the way the snow clung to his dark cloak as he dismounted, shaking the ice from his beard before delivering Lord Pemberton's summons. His words still ring in my memory with perfect clarity. He looked at me with eyes that held both respect and curiosity, and said, "Captain Ashworth, His Lordship requests your immediate presence at Pemberton Hall. You are to receive a belated reward for your distinguished service to the realm." When I pressed him for details, he merely smiled and added, "His Lordship mentioned something about a betrothal, sir. A most advantageous arrangement." I confess that sleep eluded me entirely that night. I paced the length of my chamber until the first pale light of dawn crept across the snow-covered grounds, wondering what manner of reward could possibly await me. Lord Pemberton was known throughout the county as a man of considerable influence, his wealth rivaling that of many a duke. That he would concern himself with the affairs of a minor Yorkshire captain seemed extraordinary indeed. The journey to Pemberton Hall took the better part of 2 days through treacherous winter roads. My horse picked her way carefully through drifts that rose nearly to her belly, while I pulled my military cloak tighter against the biting wind. The landscape stretched endlessly white in every direction, punctuated only by the dark skeletons of bare oak trees and the occasional wisp of smoke rising from a distant cottage chimney. There was something almost otherworldly about that journey, as if I were traveling not merely across the Yorkshire moors but into an entirely different realm of possibility. As we crested the final hill before Pemberton Hall, the sight that greeted me was nothing short of magnificent. The great house rose from the snow-covered valley like something from a medieval tapestry, its countless windows glowing warmly in the gathering dusk. For massive towers anchored the corners of the main structure, while elaborate chimneys released steady streams of smoke into the gray winter sky. The very stones seemed to pulse with centuries of history, and I felt a curious mixture of anticipation and trepidation as my horse's hoofs echoed across the ancient bridge spanning the frozen moat. Lord Pemberton received me in his private study, a chamber lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes and warmed by a fire large enough to roast an entire deer. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. When he rose to greet me, I noticed how his gaze lingered on the scar that marked my face, and something like approval flickered in his expression. He clasped my hand firmly and said, "Captain Ashworth, your reputation precedes you. The tales of your valor at Steenkirk have reached even these remote halls." He gestured for me to sit in a chair positioned near the fire and continued, "But I did not summon you here merely to offer praise. I have a proposal that I believe will benefit us both considerably." What he told me next left me speechless. Lady Vivian Blackwood, daughter of the late Earl of Ravenshollow, had been released from her betrothal to the notorious Marquess Thornfield. The reasons, Lord Pemberton explained with obvious distaste, involved certain unseemly behaviors on the Marquess's part that had come to light. Lady Vivian was now free to marry, and Lord Pemberton, as her guardian since her father's death, had chosen me as her new betrothal partner. He leaned back in his chair, studying my reaction carefully, and said, "She is a woman of exceptional beauty and refinement, Captain. Her dowry includes properties in 3 counties, and her bloodline traces back to the Plantagenets themselves. In exchange for your hand in marriage, I offer not only her considerable fortune but also a commission as colonel in my own regiment, should you choose to return to military service. I struggled to find my voice, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he proposed. When I finally managed to speak, my words came out in a hoarse whisper. My lord, I am deeply honored, but surely a woman of such station deserves better than a scarred soldier with little to his name save a crumbling manor and memories of war. Lord Pemberton's expression grew serious, and he rose to pour 2 glasses of wine from a crystal decanter on his desk. As he handed me one, he met my eyes directly and said, Captain, there are different kinds of wealth in this world. Lady Vivian has endured trials that would break lesser spirits. She needs not a man who can offer her titles and gold, but one who understands the weight of suffering and possesses the strength to help another heal. Your scars, sir, are not marks of shame but badges of honor that prove you know what it means to survive and protect others. The betrothal ceremony was set for the following evening, giving me precious little time to comprehend the magnitude of the change about to befall my life. Lord Pemberton had arranged for me to stay in the east wing of the hall, in chambers that spoke of luxury I had never known. Persian carpets covered floors of polished oak, while tapestries depicting scenes of courtly romance adorned the stone walls. A fire burned constantly in the marble hearth, tended by servants who moved like shadows, appearing to fulfill needs I had not yet spoken aloud. That first night, sleep came in fragments. I found myself wondering about Lady Vivian, this woman I was to marry within days. What had transpired between her and the Marquess Thornfield that had led to the dissolution of their betrothal? The little Lord Pemberton had painted a troubling picture of a man whose cruelty was whispered about in drawing rooms across 3 counties. I had heard tales during my military service of Thornfield's treatment of prisoners and his brutal suppression of tenant uprisings on his estates. What manner of suffering had this woman endured at his hands? Dawn brought snow that fell in heavy, silent curtains beyond my chamber windows. As I prepared for the day ahead, adjusting my best coat and ensuring my sword hung properly at my side, I caught sight of my reflection in the looking glass. The scar that marked my face seemed particularly prominent in the morning light, a stark reminder of battles fought and survived. I wondered if Lady Vivian would find me as acceptable as Lord Pemberton seemed to believe. My first glimpse of her came as I descended the grand staircase into the great hall. She stood before the massive fireplace, her figure silhouetted against the dancing flames, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. Lady Vivian possessed an ethereal quality that seemed to set her apart from the mortal world around her. Her hair fell in waves of burnished gold to her waist, while her gown of deep blue velvet complemented eyes the color of winter storms. But it was not merely her beauty that struck me. It was something in her posture, a careful stillness that spoke of a spirit that had learned to guard itself against the world. When she turned to face me, I saw those remarkable eyes widen slightly as they took in my scarred features. For a moment that stretched like eternity, we simply regarded each other across the vast expanse of the hall. Then she moved with practiced grace to meet me, her steps measured and precise upon the polished stones. She offered a curtsy that was perfection itself, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones of noble breeding touched with something softer. Captain Ashworth, I have heard much of your valor in service to the crown. I am honored to make your acquaintance. I bowed deeply, feeling suddenly conscious of my rough soldier's manners in the presence of such refined gentility. When I straightened, I met her gaze directly and replied, The honor is entirely mine, my lady. I find myself quite overwhelmed by Lord Pemberton's extraordinary generosity in proposing this union. Something flickered in her eyes at my words, an emotion I could not immediately identify. She smiled, but it did not reach those storm-colored depths, and said, Indeed, my guardian's arrangements often surprise those who find themselves subject to them. I trust you will find the match advantageous, Captain. There was a formality in her manner that spoke of careful training, but beneath it I sensed currents I could not yet fathom. As we walked together toward the morning room where breakfast awaited, I noticed how she seemed to start slightly at unexpected sounds, how her eyes would dart toward doorways as if expecting unwelcome visitors to materialize. The betrothal ceremony itself took place that evening in the great hall, beneath tapestries that had witnessed centuries of such occasions. The ancient stones seemed to absorb the flickering light of 100 candles, creating an atmosphere that was both magnificent and intimate. Lord Pemberton had invited the county's most prominent families, and the hall buzzed with conversation as lords and ladies in their finest attire gathered to witness our union. As we stood together before the bishop, Lady Vivian's hand rested lightly on my arm, and I could feel the slight tremor that ran through her fingers. When the moment came for her to speak her vows of acceptance, her voice was steady but soft, barely audible above the crackling of the great fire behind us. I found myself studying her profile in the candlelight, noting the delicate curve of her jaw and the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her pale cheeks. The bishop raised his hands in blessing and proclaimed, By the grace of God and in the presence of these witnesses, I declare Captain Roderick Ashworth and Lady Vivian Blackwood betrothed, their union to be blessed in holy matrimony within the fortnight. The assembled guests raised their glasses in toast, and the hall filled with congratulations and well wishes. During the feast that followed, I observed Lady Vivian with growing fascination. She moved through the social requirements of the evening with flawless grace, accepting congratulations and engaging in conversation with the ease of one born to such occasions. Yet I noticed how she avoided the touch of male guests, how she positioned herself always within easy reach of an exit, how her smile, though beautiful, seemed to require tremendous effort to maintain. As the evening progressed and wine flowed freely among the guests, I found myself seated beside her during the final course. The conversation around us had grown animated, tales of hunt and politics filling the air, when she turned to me with an expression of genuine curiosity. She leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper, and said, "Captain, if I may ask, do you ever find it difficult to return to civilian life after experiencing the intensity of battle? I imagine the contrast must be quite jarring." Her question surprised me with its perceptiveness, cutting straight to something I had scarcely acknowledged even to myself. I considered my words carefully before responding. "Indeed, my lady, there are times when the quiet of peacetime feels more unsettling than the chaos of war. In battle, one knows exactly where one stands, what dangers lurk nearby. In drawing rooms and at dinner parties, the threats are far more subtle, the rules of engagement considerably more complex." A smile touched her lips, the first truly genuine expression I had seen from her all evening, and she nodded slowly. "Yes, I understand that feeling entirely, Captain. Sometimes the most beautiful settings can harbor the greatest dangers, while scarred and battle-worn exteriors often conceal the gentlest hearts." As she spoke these words, her eyes met mine with startling directness, and I felt something pass between us, a recognition that perhaps we shared more common ground than either of us had initially supposed. The rest of the evening took on a different quality after that exchange, as if we had established the first fragile thread of understanding between us. When the last guests finally departed and the servants began extinguishing the candles, Lady Vivian approached me one final time. The great hall had grown quiet except for the settling of logs in the massive fireplace and the distant sound of wind against the ancient windows. She paused before me, and in a voice so soft I had to lean closer to hear her words, she said, "Captain Ashworth, I hope you will not think ill of me for speaking plainly, but I find myself grateful that fate has placed me in the hands of a man who understands that beauty and brokenness often exist side by side. I pray that our union will bring healing to us both." Her words lingered in my mind long after she had retired to her chambers, and I found myself pacing the corridors of Pemberton Hall well into the early hours of morning. The ancient stones seemed to whisper secrets in the darkness, their surfaces worn smooth by countless generations of footsteps. What had she meant about beauty and brokenness existing side by side? What healing did she believe we both required? The following days passed in a curious dance of formal courtship and tentative discovery. Lady Vivian proved to be far more complex than I had initially imagined. In the mornings, we would walk together through Lord Pemberton's extensive gardens, now transformed into a wonderland of ice and snow. The bare branches of ancient oaks created intricate patterns against the pale winter sky, while frozen fountains stood like crystal sculptures throughout the formal parterre. During these walks, I began to glimpse the woman beneath the careful veneer of noble breeding. She possessed a sharp intelligence that revealed itself in unexpected observations about the books we discussed from Lord Pemberton's vast library. When I mentioned my admiration for military histories, she surprised me by demonstrating a thorough understanding of tactical principles that would have impressed my fellow officers. She paused beside a snow-laden rosebush one morning, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, and said, "I find it fascinating how generals must balance aggression with restraint, Captain. Too much force applied too quickly can shatter one's own position as easily as the enemy's." I studied her profile as she spoke, noting how her eyes seemed focused on something far beyond the frozen garden, and replied, "Indeed, my lady, the finest commanders understand that victory often comes not from overwhelming strength, but from knowing when to advance and when to hold one's ground. Patience can be the most powerful weapon in any arsenal." Something in her expression shifted at my words, a flicker of what might have been relief crossing her delicate features. She turned to face me fully then, and for a moment I thought she might speak more directly about whatever shadows haunted her past. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "Yes, Captain. Patience and the wisdom to recognize when retreat is not defeat but strategy." The afternoons we spent in the great library, a magnificent chamber with shelves reaching nearly to the vaulted ceiling. Ancient volumes bound in leather and gold surrounded us like silent witnesses to centuries of accumulated knowledge. Lady Vivian would often select books of poetry, reading passages aloud in a voice that transformed the written words into something almost musical. I confess that I found myself paying more attention to the sound of her voice than to the verses themselves, mesmerized by the way she breathed life into the ancient texts. It was during one of these library sessions that I first noticed her reaction to sudden noises. A servant had entered quietly to tend the fire, but when a log shifted and cracked loudly in the hearth, Lady Vivian started so violently that the book fell from her hands. Her face went pale as parchment, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. I moved quickly to her side, careful not to touch her without permission, and spoke in the gentle tones I had once used to calm wounded horses after battle. "My lady, you are safe." It was merely the fire settling. Nothing more. She closed her eyes and pressed one hand to her chest, fighting to regain her composure. When she opened them again, I saw something raw and vulnerable in their depths, a glimpse behind the careful mask she wore. She looked at me with an expression that seemed to weigh my trustworthiness, and said quietly, "Forgive me, Captain. I fear I have grown overly sensitive to unexpected sounds. It is a foolish weakness that I struggle to overcome." I shook my head firmly and replied, "There is nothing foolish about reactions born of experience, my lady. I myself start awake at the sound of hoofbeats in the night, imagining cavalry charges that exist only in memory. Our minds and bodies bear witness to what we have endured, and there is no shame in that testimony." The gratitude in her eyes was unmistakable, and from that moment something shifted between us. She began to relax slightly in my presence, allowing glimpses of humor and genuine warmth to emerge from behind her careful guard. In the evenings, we would sit before the great fireplace in the main hall, often joined by Lord Pemberton, who regaled us with tales of his younger days at court. But it was during the quiet moments when conversation lulled that I found myself most acutely aware of Lady Vivian's presence. She had a habit of gazing into the flames with an expression of profound melancholy, as if seeing scenes from her past dancing in the flickering light. One evening, as snow fell heavily beyond the diamond-paned windows and the wind howled like a living thing around the ancient stones, she surprised me by asking about my military service. Her questions were not the usual polite inquiries about glory and honor, but penetrating examinations of how a man maintains his humanity in the face of necessary violence. She turned from her contemplation of the fire to look at me directly, her storm-colored eyes reflecting the dancing flames, and said, "Captain, I have often wondered how soldiers preserve their capacity for gentleness after witnessing such brutality. Does the heart not grow calloused, like hands that work with rough tools?" I considered her question carefully, recognizing the deeper current beneath her words. When I spoke, it was with complete honesty. "The heart does indeed develop protective layers, my lady, much as the body grows stronger through controlled hardship. But I learned that true strength lies not in becoming impervious to pain, but in choosing how we respond to it. The finest men I served alongside were those who emerged from darkness with their compassion intact, who used their understanding of suffering to ease the burdens of others." She nodded slowly, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she blinked them away before they could fall. Something in that moment told me we were approaching the heart of whatever burden she carried, the source of the careful control she maintained over every aspect of her behavior. As our wedding day drew near, I found myself increasingly protective of her, though I could not have explained exactly why. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to hold herself in constant readiness for some unnamed threat, or the manner in which her breathing would change when certain topics arose in conversation. Whatever the reason, I began to feel that I was not merely gaining a wife but accepting a sacred trust, becoming guardian to something precious and fragile that had been nearly shattered by forces I did not yet understand. The night before our wedding, as I sat in my chamber reviewing the ceremony details, a soft knock came at my door. When I opened it, I found Lady Vivian standing in the corridor, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the cold. Her face was pale but resolute, and in her eyes I saw a determination that had not been there before. She looked up at me with an expression that seemed to encompass both fear and courage, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Captain Ashworth, there is something I must tell you before we speak our vows. Something about my past that you have a right to know. Will you meet me in the portrait hall beneath the tapestries? There are words that must be spoken in private, away from listening ears and watching eyes." The gravity in her voice told me that whatever confession awaited would change everything between us. As I nodded my agreement, I could not have imagined how profoundly her words would transform not only my understanding of her, but my very conception of what love and marriage could become. The portrait hall at midnight was a chamber transformed. Shadows danced across ancient tapestries depicting scenes of chivalric romance, while the flickering light of a dozen candles created an atmosphere both intimate and otherworldly. Lady Vivian stood before the largest tapestry, one that showed a knight kneeling before his beloved, offering his sword in pledge of protection. She had positioned herself so that her face remained partially in shadow, and I could see her hands trembling despite her obvious efforts at composure. When I approached, she turned toward me but did not meet my eyes directly. Instead, she focused on some point past my shoulder, as if the words she needed to speak could only be uttered while looking beyond the present moment into some distant place where truth lived without judgment. She drew a shaking breath and began in a voice so quiet I had to step closer to hear her clearly. Captain Ashworth, what I am about to tell you may cause you to withdraw your offer of marriage, and I would not blame you if it did. But I cannot enter into holy matrimony while concealing the truth of what transpired during my betrothal to the Marquess Thornfield. I remained silent, sensing that any interruption might cause her fragile courage to crumble entirely. She continued, her voice gaining strength even as her hands continued to tremble. The Marquess is a man who believes that power grants him the right to break whatever he touches. During the months of our courtship, he took great pleasure in demonstrating his control over every aspect of my existence. She paused, pressing her lips together as if the next words required physical effort to release. He would arrive at my family's estate without warning, often in the company of men whose very presence filled our servants with terror. He delighted in small cruelties, criticizing everything from my manner of dress to my choice of books, always in front of others, always designed to diminish whatever confidence I possessed. I felt a cold fury building in my chest, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still, knowing that any display of emotion might cause her to retreat from this painful revelation. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she continued. But it was not the public humiliations that broke something inside me, Captain. It was what he whispered to me during private moments, the threats he made against my younger brother Edmund, the promises of what he would do to anyone who tried to protect me if I ever defied his wishes. She finally looked directly at me then, and in her eyes I saw a pain so profound it made my own wartime experiences seem like gentle rainfall compared to a devastating storm. He would describe in vivid detail how easily accidents could befall those I loved, how a young man like Edmund might suffer a fall from his horse on a dark night, or how a fire might mysteriously consume the cottages of tenants who spoke against their betters. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and I felt the familiar surge of protective rage that had served me well on battlefields. But I kept my voice level and gentle as I spoke. Lady Vivian, you need fear no judgment from me. Please, continue. She nodded gratefully and went on. The final months before Lord Pemberton discovered his true nature and dissolved our betrothal were the darkest of my life. I felt as though I were drowning in a sea of helplessness, watching myself become someone I no longer recognized. Someone weak and frightened and broken. Tears were flowing freely down her cheeks now, glistening like liquid silver in the candlelight. I stopped sleeping properly, started at every sound, found myself unable to enjoy even the simplest pleasures. Books became meaningless marks on pages. Music sounded like noise, and food turned to ash in my mouth. She wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection that broke my heart to witness. What terrifies me most, Captain, is that I fear I am no longer capable of being a proper wife to any man. The thought of physical intimacy fills me with panic, and I worry that the damage he inflicted upon my spirit may be permanent. The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch forever, filled only with the soft crackling of the candles and the distant sound of wind against ancient stones. I found myself thinking of the wounded soldiers I had tended during my campaigns, men whose bodies had been broken but whose spirits could be healed with patience and care. I stepped closer to her, moving slowly and deliberately so as not to startle her, and when I spoke, my voice carried all the gentleness I possessed. My dear lady, there is nothing you have told me that diminishes my desire to call you wife. Indeed, your courage in surviving such treatment and your strength in speaking these truths only increases my admiration for you. She looked up at me with an expression of disbelief, as if my words were too good to be trusted. But Captain, surely you understand what I am telling you. I am damaged, perhaps beyond repair. What manner of marriage could we have? I reached out slowly, telegraphing my movement so she could pull away if she wished, and gently took her hands in mine. They were ice-cold despite the warmth of the hall, and I could feel the tremors running through her fingers. Looking directly into her storm-colored eyes, I spoke with complete sincerity. Lady Vivian, I have seen men's bodies torn apart by cannon fire and their minds shattered by the horrors of war. I have learned that healing is possible when two souls commit to walking the path together with patience and understanding. I paused, ensuring she was truly hearing my words before continuing. The scars we bear, whether visible like mine or hidden like yours, are not marks of weakness but testimony to battles we have survived. You are not broken, my lady. You are a warrior who has endured a campaign of deliberate cruelty and emerged with your essential goodness intact. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but now they seemed to carry relief rather than despair. You truly do not see me as damaged goods? As something spoiled by another man's touch? The pain in her voice nearly undid my careful composure, but I kept my tone steady and sure. I see you as a woman of extraordinary courage who deserves to be cherished and protected. If you will have me, I pledge that our marriage will be a sanctuary where healing can flourish at its own pace, without pressure or expectations beyond mutual respect and growing affection. She squeezed my hands then, the first truly voluntary touch she had initiated between us. "And what of your own needs, Captain? What of the intimacy that marriage should provide?" I smiled gently, thinking of all the ways love could be expressed beyond physical union. "My greatest need, Lady Vivian, is to be useful to someone who matters to me. If I can spend my days knowing that my presence brings you peace rather than fear, that my protection shields you from further harm, then I will count myself the most fortunate of men." For the first time since I had known her, Lady Vivian smiled with genuine joy rather than careful politeness. It transformed her entire countenance, revealing the radiant spirit that had survived beneath layers of protective armor. She raised our joined hands and pressed them to her heart, her voice strong and clear as she said, "Then let us build something beautiful together, Captain Ashworth. Something that proves love can triumph over even the darkest of pasts." Our wedding was set to take place 3 days later, but fate, it seemed, had other plans for us. The morning after Lady Vivian's confession, a messenger arrived at Pemberton Hall bearing news that chilled my blood. The Marquess Thornfield had taken residence at Blackmore Castle, a fortress barely 10 miles distant, and was spreading vicious rumors throughout the county about Lady Vivian's supposed moral failings and my own unsuitability as a husband. Lord Pemberton summoned me to his study immediately upon receiving this intelligence, his face grim with worry and barely contained anger. He paced before the great fireplace like a caged wolf, occasionally stopping to strike his fist against the mantelpiece. He turned to me with fire in his eyes and said, "The blackguard claims that Vivian is damaged goods, unsuitable for any gentleman of breeding. He suggests that only a desperate fortune hunter would accept such a bride, and implies that your war service has left you similarly compromised in mind and body." I felt the familiar surge of battle rage that had once served me well on foreign fields, but I forced myself to think strategically rather than react emotionally. The Marquess was clearly attempting to isolate Lady Vivian socially, to make our union appear desperate rather than honorable. I met Lord Pemberton's gaze steadily and replied, "My lord, Thornfield's words reveal far more about his own character than they do about Lady Vivian's virtue or my fitness as a husband. A man of true honor does not seek to destroy those who have escaped his cruelty. What concerned me most was not the damage to our reputations, but the effect these rumors might have on Lady Vivian's fragile confidence." When I sought her out in the morning room, I found her standing by the frost-covered windows, her reflection ghostly pale in the diamond-shaped panes. She had clearly heard the news, for her shoulders were rigid with tension, and her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles showed white against her dark blue gown. She did not turn when I entered, but spoke to my reflection in the glass, her voice hollow with defeat. "Perhaps this is God's judgment upon me, Captain. Perhaps I was foolish to believe I could escape the shadow Thornfield cast over my life." I moved to stand beside her, careful not to crowd her space, and spoke with quiet conviction. "The only judgment that matters, my lady, is our own recognition of truth. Thornfield's lies cannot diminish your worth any more than winter frost can permanently damage the roses that will bloom again come spring." She finally turned to face me, and I saw that her eyes held not tears but a growing spark of defiance. "What do you propose we do? How does one fight whispers and innuendo?" I had been considering this very question since receiving the news, drawing upon my military experience to devise a strategy that would protect Lady Vivian while exposing Thornfield's true nature. The answer, when it came to me, was elegantly simple. I smiled with grim satisfaction and explained, "We invite him to our wedding, my lady. We make it clear that his presence would honor us, and we ensure that every prominent family in the county witnesses our public celebration of your virtue and our mutual devotion." Her eyes widened with surprise and perhaps a touch of fear. "Invite him? Captain, surely that is the last thing we should do. His very presence would cast a pall over what should be a joyous occasion." I shook my head gently and replied, "On the contrary, my dear. In battle, the most effective strategy is often to force your enemy to fight on ground of your choosing. Here, surrounded by Lord Pemberton's allies and in the sanctified setting of holy matrimony, Thornfield will be compelled to behave as a gentleman or reveal his true nature before witnesses who matter." Lord Pemberton, when I explained my plan, initially resisted the idea, but as I outlined the strategic advantages, his expression shifted from skepticism to grudging admiration. Within hours, invitations had been dispatched throughout the county, including one to Blackmore Castle that was worded with exquisite courtesy and impossible to refuse without appearing churlish. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation, but also of growing intimacy between Lady Vivian and myself. Having shared her deepest fears with me, she seemed lighter somehow, as if the burden of secrecy had been the heaviest chain binding her spirit. We spent long hours walking in the gardens, talking of everything and nothing, building the foundation of trust upon which our future would rest. The morning of our wedding dawned clear and cold, with sunlight streaming through ice-crystal air and snow sparkling like diamonds across the grounds of Pemberton Hall. Lady Vivian appeared at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that seemed to glow in the colored light streaming through the chapel's ancient windows. Her hair was dressed with pearls and winter roses, and her eyes held a peace I had not seen there before. The ceremony proceeded without incident until the moment when the bishop called for any who would speak against our union to declare themselves or forever hold their peace. In the silence that followed, the great doors of the chapel opened with a resonance that echoed off the stone walls, and the Marquess Thornfield entered with theatrical timing. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, his once handsome features now marked by the cruelty that had shaped his character. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never learned the meaning of genuine remorse. He wore clothing of the finest quality, but no amount of silk and gold braid could disguise the essential corruption of his soul. He approached the altar with measured steps, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chapel as he spoke. "I do not come to object to this union, but rather to offer my congratulations to Captain Ashworth. He has shown remarkable courage in accepting a bride that others might consider compromised." A murmur of shock rippled through the assembled guests, but I had anticipated this moment. Rather than rising to his bait, I took Lady Vivian's hand in mine and spoke with calm dignity. "My Lord Marquess, your words reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what constitutes true courage. Any man can break what is fragile, but it takes genuine strength to nurture what has been wounded back to wholeness." I turned to address the entire congregation, my voice carrying the authority I had learned commanding men in battle. "Lady Vivian has shown me that the greatest beauty lies not in perfection, but in the triumph of goodness over adversity. She is more precious to me than all the unblemished treasures in Christendom." The effect of my words was immediate and powerful. I saw tears in the eyes of many guests, while others nodded in approval of sentiments that resonated with their own understanding of life's trials. Most importantly, I felt Lady Vivian's hand squeeze mine with newfound strength. Thornfield's face darkened as he realized his gambit had failed spectacularly. In attempting to shame us, he had instead provided the perfect stage for a public declaration of devotion that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The bishop, sensing the moment's significance, raised his voice in blessing. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As I lifted Lady Vivian's veil and saw the joy shining in her storm-colored eyes, I knew that we had done something more significant than merely exchanging vows. We had proven that love could indeed triumph over the shadows of the past, that two wounded souls could find healing in their commitment to each other's happiness. 6 months have passed since that winter wedding, and as I write these words in the study of our own home, I can hear Lady Vivian's laughter drifting in from the garden where she tends the roses that are just beginning to bloom with spring's arrival. The healing we both sought has come gradually, built day by day through small acts of kindness and growing trust. We have learned that true intimacy encompasses far more than physical union, that the meeting of minds and hearts can create a bond stronger than any forged by passion alone. If you are watching this story from anywhere in the world, I hope it reminds you that your past does not define your future, that damaged things can indeed be made beautiful again through patient care and genuine love. Please take a moment to share this story with someone who might need to hear that healing is possible, and subscribe to join us for more tales of hope triumphing over despair. Remember that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in avoiding scars, but in choosing to see them as proof that we survived, that we endured, and that we remain capable of creating something beautiful from the ashes of what came before.